Let's talk about Monkey D. Dragon. This video will contain spoilers for the Egghead arc of One Piece, so if you're not caught up to that point, maybe consider saving this video for another day. But for those of you who are caught up, I wanted to talk about this. So with the Kuma flashback being revealed, a lot of people are switching up on Dragon. They're saying he's a fraud, he's a punk, he's spineless, etc. And I get why people are saying this. People have been watching Luffy jump into action for his friends without a moment's thought since 1997. And that's a common thing with different anime, especially battle shonen. Like Naruto went to hell and back trying to save Sasuke, even petitioning the Raikage on his behalf. Ichigo's whole story can be all too briefly summarized as, this dude'll fight anyone to keep his friends safe, and that's kind of a trope for MCs in battle shonen. But when it comes to Dragon, people are forgetting something, and that is context. So speaking of the context, let's get into why people are calling Dragon a fraud. In Kuma's flashback, we meet Ginny. She's a lifelong friend of Kuma, and someone who in another timeline would have been his wife. She's also a loyal member of the Revolutionary Army, and when she's captured, Dragon does absolutely nothing about it. If that was all of the context, I would understand why people are so up in arms, but it just isn't. First of all, we aren't talking about Luffy here. We're not talking about the main character. We're talking about Dragon. He doesn't get the same plot armor as Luffy, and so he can't afford to fly off the handle for every loss. What people wanted Dragon to do is gather his revolutionaries and just storm the city of Marijois to retrieve Ginny. Something that would have resulted in not only the loss of Dragon's life, but the end of the Revolutionary Army and victory for the oppressors of this world, for the Tenryubito. Dragon is not like Luffy. He doesn't get to live like a one-man army. He is leading an army. He has to weigh the pros and cons of any and every move that he makes, and everything that he does must bring the revolution closer to success. If Dragon had made the decision to go after Ginny, he would have been risking the entire revolution. He just can't do that. Now, I've spoken about this multiple times over on TikTok, and I've gotten responses like, oh, he should have done something, to which I will reiterate that his forces were simply not enough to take on a mission like that. Then people will come in and say, well, Luffy would have done it. And yes, I agree wholeheartedly. We saw Luffy do this type of thing again and again on a smaller scale, but let's not forget that if Luffy were on his own, his journey would have ended far earlier. Without Dragon being there, Luffy dies in Logtown. Without Garp, Luffy would have been detained at Water 7. I mean, without Dragon, Luffy doesn't convince Ivankov to take him out of Marijois, meaning the jailbreak may have never happened. Luffy doesn't think about the consequences, and this leads to him needing help and sometimes even rescue. Something that would not be coming for Dragon should he fumble in this mission. The only reason that Luffy is so free is because other people come in when his foolhardiness gets him in trouble. And I do think that it's important to state that because people keep treating Dragon like he should be acting like a main character. Now, another complaint that I've seen about Dragon is if he's simply unprepared for this level of assault on the world government, then the series should have made that more clear. That we haven't seen enough evidence to say that that's the reason that he would hold back from this mission. But we have seen that evidence, it's just that a lot of people are forgetting that that evidence is there. First of all, at the time that Ginny and Kuma signed up for the Revolutionary Army, they were barely able to fund themselves. They were still looking for a way to fund the army, and their primary strategy was, as it still kind of is, to send a small group of revolutionaries to train an army that was already willing to fight. They send a small group in order to teach the skills necessary to a much larger force, and that much larger force is the bulk of the muscle that's actually overthrowing these governments. So while the Revolutionary Army is getting victories, those victories cannot be attributed purely to the strength of the army itself. Now, 8 years after they sign on to the Revolutionary Army, which is where Ginny is taken, we see a flashback of Kuma training a young Sabo. So if we want to know the strength of the Revolutionary Army at this point, we can look to the conversation that Dragon and Sabo had because this is clearly happening right after Sabo was recruited. In the flashback between Dragon and Sabo, we see Dragon telling Sabo that while he understands his frustration, the Revolutionary Army is just not strong enough to overthrow the government of Goa yet. So when we're discussing whether or not Dragon is a fraud for his inactivity with Ginny, we need to think of the Revolutionary Army of that time. This was a Revolutionary Army that wasn't even capable yet of overthrowing the leadership of the Goa Kingdom. Now, the Goa Kingdom is not a weak nation per se, it's not a small nation either, but it is a relatively peaceful nation that exists within the weakest of the blues, the East Blue. Now, yes, we all know that some very, very strong people come from the East Blue, but when the East Blue is referred to as the weakest sea, it's more in terms of the everyday threats that you're going to go up against. The South, the North, and the West are far harsher living conditions than the East. This means that the average Marine in that area is most likely going to be a lot stronger than the average Marine in the East too, to compensate for these increased dangers. So if Dragon's army isn't able to overthrow a government in the weakest of the blues with the lowest level of Marines there, and it's an island on the surface, I think it is a little bit ridiculous to assume that he should take that army, scale the Red Line, somehow infiltrate Merijois with that group, and then launch a full-scale war in the Holy City, where they'd be going up against admirals, the fleet admiral, the commander-in-chief, potentially God's Knights, the Gorosei, and the entire standing army of Merijois all at the same time. This would have been an absolute massacre that would have snuffed out the flames of the rebellion. I mean, looking at the Reverie, we can see what the current Revolutionary Army is capable of, and they were still barely successful in rescuing Kuma, and that was a stealth mission where a small elite group infiltrated Merijois during a time where tons of nobles were coming and going, meaning they'd have an easier time slipping in, and the only reason that they were as successful as they were is because they had Fujitora tying up Aramaki for them, so they had 2 admirals that were there that they did not have to fight against. The difference in power between the forces that Dragon could bring to bear and the forces that the world government could bring to bear was just too great. This would have been a suicide mission, and Dragon knew that. He wasn't being weak, he was being smart. And one thing that I'd like to point out is that while a lot of fans of the series don't seem to realize what Dragon is doing or why Dragon's doing it, the characters in the story that work closely with Dragon and work in the Revolutionary Army understand entirely that it's just that his hands are tied, and they will eventually get their get back, they just can't do it right now. Kuma has 0 complaints towards Dragon when he doesn't go after Ginny, because Kuma knows that it's just impossible. And then after Dragon offers Kuma the services of any doctors that the Revolutionary Army can bring to bear, depending on the translation that you're reading, Kuma either says, "I appreciate that," or "I owe you one, Dragon." Because Kuma knows that Dragon does genuinely care. Dragon cares about Ginny, he cares about Kuma, and he cares about Bonnie, but he can only do what he can do, and in this case that is offering medical services. We see this again in the Marineford arc, where Ivankov is totally content remaining in Impel Down until Dragon mobilizes his forces. He says, "If I escape now, I would just end up a fugitive again." Because Ivankov is not simply thinking of the here and now, he's thinking of the larger picture. Once Dragon's army is strong enough, Ivankov could break out of Impel Down and remain free, because he would be surrounded by the forces of the Revolutionary Army. But at that point, during the Impel Down arc, the army was still far too weak to guarantee that safety. Both of these people understand that acting recklessly isn't always the best option if you are slowly building towards a much larger goal than those of basically any pirate on the sea, and you have to take care to do what you can, but not overextend. And a full-scale attack on Merijois is 100% overextending. I mean, heck, that would be overextending for current Luffy, let alone the Revolutionary Army way back in this flashback. Dragon has been suffering victories and losses for decades, constantly looking forward towards the day where every fallen comrade can be avenged. When Dragon finally makes his move, he is going to enact justice. Like, the world government is not going to go unpunished. But the only reason he's going to be able to do that, the only reason he can get his get back, is because of the fact that he stayed the course, numbed his heart, and acted like the general that he is. That is Dragon's role in the story. He works behind the scenes, he slowly builds up this kind of fourth power in the world in the form of the Revolutionary Army, and he only does what he can do. The difference between Luffy and Dragon is that Luffy lives his life not caring about consequences, and Dragon lives his life having to care about everyone's consequences. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. This is my first real YouTube video. I am primarily a TikTok creator. If you'd like to see thousands of other videos that I've made, you can go ahead and check me out at SaigaRunner on TikTok. I hope that you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe out there.